The past does not disappear simply because time has passed. Experiences do not dissolve into nothingness. They descend beneath awareness and take residence in the unconscious. What is not consciously processed does not vanish. It becomes part of the hidden architecture of the psyche. There, beyond deliberate thought, it continues influencing perception, emotion, and behavior in subtle but powerful ways. For empaths, this dynamic is even more intense. Sensitivity magnifies experience. An empath does not merely witness events. They internalize emotional atmospheres. A harsh tone, a moment of rejection, a parent's silent disappointment. These impressions sink deeply. When such moments are not understood or integrated, they become unconscious patterns. Later in life, similar tones, expressions, or relational dynamics activate those buried imprints, and the reaction feels immediate and overwhelming. This is why an empath may overreact to minor criticism. The present moment is not the only thing being experienced. The unconscious retrieves stored emotional memory and layers it over the current situation. What appears small externally feels enormous internally because it is amplified by unresolved history. The psyche does not distinguish cleanly between then and now. It responds to emotional familiarity. It functions as a protective reservoir. Painful experiences are often repressed because they were too overwhelming to process at the time. The mind, in its wisdom, buries what it cannot yet bear. But repression is not resolution. What is buried remains alive, seeking expression through projection triggers, dreams, bodily tension, and repetitive relational patterns. Projection is one of the clearest signs that the past lives unconsciously. Traits, fears, or wounds that remain unacknowledged within are perceived outside. An empath who was once betrayed may unconsciously expect betrayal everywhere. Neutral behavior can be interpreted as threat. The outer world becomes a canvas onto which inner history is painted. This is not weakness, it is psychological continuity. The psyche strives for coherence. If a belief was formed early, I am too much, I am not enough, love leaves, the unconscious gathers evidence to confirm it. This confirmation bias operates beneath awareness, shaping choices and interpretations. The individual believes they are responding to reality, while in truth they are responding to internalized memory. The body also carries the past. Emotional experiences are stored somatically. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, chronic fatigue, or anxiety can reflect unresolved emotional residue. The nervous system, once conditioned by prolonged stress or unpredictability, remains hyper alert. Even in safe environments, it scans for danger. The past becomes a physiological state rather than a distant event. Dreams frequently reveal what consciousness avoids. Symbols, recurring scenarios, or archetypal imagery often represent unfinished emotional business. The unconscious communicates indirectly, inviting awareness. Ignoring these signals does not silence them, it intensifies their expression in other forms. For empaths, there is an additional layer: absorbed emotion. Sometimes what lives in the unconscious is not solely personal history, but inherited or absorbed patterns, family dynamics, generational fears, and collective expectations can be internalized without conscious choice. The empath's porous boundaries allow these influences to penetrate deeply. Over time, it becomes difficult to distinguish personal truth from inherited narrative. When the past lives unconsciously, it governs identity. One begins to describe oneself through wounds. The abandoned child becomes the adult who fears intimacy. The unheard adolescent becomes the adult who over-explains. The caregiver who never received care becomes the adult who cannot stop giving. These patterns feel natural because they have been rehearsed internally for years. Bringing the past into consciousness does not mean reliving it dramatically. It means observing patterns without judgment. It means asking, why does this trigger feel familiar? What earlier memory carries the same emotional tone? What belief about myself was formed in that moment? Awareness interrupts automatic repetition. It creates psychological distance between stimulus and response. The unconscious loses power when illuminated. Patterns once compulsive become choices. Emotional reactions slow down. The individual begins to differentiate between present reality and historical echo. Memory remains, but it no longer dictates perception. Without such awareness, the psyche continues repeating unfinished stories, seeking resolution through reenactment. Relationships mirror childhood dynamics. Conflicts echo earlier disappointments. The same emotional themes appear in different forms. The past persists not because it is stronger than the present, but because it has not yet been integrated into conscious understanding. Empaths possess a nervous system attuned to nuance. They do not simply hear words, they register tone, rhythm, hesitation, and the emotional undercurrent beneath language. They do not just observe expressions, they sense shifts in energy, subtle contractions, and unspoken tension. This heightened receptivity allows them to understand others with unusual depth. Yet the same sensitivity that enables profound compassion also makes them vulnerable to absorption. Absorption is not empathy alone. It is the internalization of another person's emotional state as if it were one's own. An anxious room can leave the empath restless for hours. A friend's grief can settle heavily in the chest. A partner's frustration can quietly become self-blame. The boundary between your feeling and my feeling blurs, not because their perception is porous. In early life, this absorption often begins as adaptation. Sensitive children quickly learn to scan environments for emotional weather. They sense when caregivers are stressed, disappointed, or distant. To maintain connection and safety, they adjust themselves accordingly. They become attuned, accommodating, and hyper-aware. Over time, this attunement becomes automatic. The nervous system wires itself to detect and absorb. Absorption, however, is only the first half of the empath's potential. Without transformation, absorbed emotion accumulates. It creates internal congestion, confusion about one's own desires, exhaustion without clear cause, resentment masked as generosity. The empath may begin to feel overwhelmed by life itself, not realizing that much of what they carry is unprocessed energy that was never theirs to begin with. Transformation requires conscious differentiation. It begins with the simple but powerful question: is this feeling truly mine? This inquiry interrupts automatic identification. Instead of merging instantly with external emotion, the empath pauses. They observe the sensation in the body, the thoughts attached to it, and the context in which it arose. Awareness creates a boundary where none previously existed. Transformation also involves metabolizing personal pain rather than storing it. When empaths suppress their own hurt to care for others, their emotional world becomes crowded. Unexpressed grief does not disappear. It settles into the psyche, shaping mood and perception. To transform, one must allow personal emotions to move through fully felt, acknowledged, and understood. This process converts raw pain into insight. Emotional alchemy is not mystical, it is psychological integration. Anger, when transformed, becomes clarity about boundaries. Sadness becomes depth and empathy without self erasure. Fear becomes discernment. The same sensitivity that once caused overwhelm becomes a refined instrument of wisdom. But this shift only occurs when emotion is processed rather than hoarded. Boundaries are essential to transformation. An empath without boundaries is like a sponge never wrung out. Energy accumulates until saturation leads to burnout. Boundaries do not reduce compassion. They protect its sustainability. Saying no, stepping away, limiting exposure to chaotic environments. These are not acts of coldness. They are acts of self-regulation that preserve the capacity to give consciously. Another aspect of transformation is recognizing projection. Sometimes what the empath absorbs resonates with unresolved personal wounds. A friend's criticism may sting deeply, not because of its intensity, but because it touches an old belief of inadequacy. In such moments, transformation involves distinguishing between external emotion and internal echo. The present interaction becomes an opportunity to illuminate what still seeks healing. Creative expression often serves as a channel for transformation. Writing, art, movement, and reflective dialogue convert internalized emotion into external form. What was once an indistinct heaviness becomes articulated meaning. Expression prevents stagnation and allows energy to circulate rather than remain trapped within. Empaths who learn to transform rather than merely absorb develop extraordinary resilience. They remain open without being consumed. They understand suffering without drowning in it. Their sensitivity becomes directed rather than reactive. Instead of carrying the emotional burdens of everyone around them, they become filters, capable of feeling deeply while releasing what does not belong to them. The shift from absorption to transformation marks psychological maturity. It requires self-trust, disciplined awareness, and the courage to prioritize inner balance over external approval. Sensitivity alone is not power. Power emerges when sensitivity is guided by consciousness, when emotion is examined rather than automatically owned, and when compassion includes oneself as fully as it includes others. Every individual carries a shadow, the hidden aspects of the psyche that were denied, rejected, or suppressed in order to survive, belong, or be accepted. The shadow is not evil, it is simply everything that consciousness refused to claim. Traits labeled as too much, emotions deemed unacceptable, desires that threatened approval, anger that risked abandonment. These fragments do not disappear. They move into the unconscious and wait. For empaths, the shadow is often filled with disowned strength. Sensitivity is usually encouraged, but anger, selfishness, and assertiveness may have been discouraged early in life. Many empaths learned that harmony ensured love. As a result, they buried impulses that could disrupt connection. Over time, they identified only with the caring, understanding, accommodating parts of themselves. The rest fell into shadow. Shadow work begins with the recognition that what irritates, triggers, or fascinates us in others often reflects what lives unacknowledged within. The person who appears arrogant may be mirroring disowned confidence. The one perceived as cold may reflect suppressed boundaries. Emotional reactions that seem disproportionate are often signals pointing towards shadow material. Projection is the shadow's disguise. When qualities remain unconscious, they are perceived externally. An empath who believes they are never selfish may feel deep resentment toward those who prioritize themselves. The resentment is not only about the other person, it is about a denied capacity within. By refusing to acknowledge personal needs, the psyche compensates through judgment. Liberation begins when projection is withdrawn. Instead of asking, why are they like that? The question shifts to what part of me reacts so strongly and why. This redirection of inquiry is uncomfortable. It dismantles the identity built solely on light, yet it restores wholeness. The psyche no longer needs to split itself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Shadow work also involves confronting buried pain. Old humiliations, betrayals, and unmet needs form complexes, emotionally charged clusters of memory and belief. These complexes operate autonomously, influencing behavior without conscious awareness. A minor disagreement may activate a childhood wound of not being heard. The adult reaction then carries the intensity of the past. Facing the shadow requires tolerating discomfort without immediate defense. Instead of justifying, suppressing, or blaming, one observes the body's sensations are noticed. The narrative attached to the feeling is questioned. Gradually, what once felt overwhelming becomes understandable. Understanding reduces fear, and reduced fear diminishes reactivity. For empaths, anger is frequently a central shadow element. Many were conditioned to associate anger with danger or rejection. As a result, anger was repressed and replaced with compliance. Yet unexpressed anger does not dissolve. It turns inward as guilt or outward as passive aggression. Acknowledging anger as a natural boundary setting force transforms it from destructive impulse into protective clarity. Desire can also reside in the shadow. The longing for recognition, success, autonomy, or even power may conflict with an identity centered on humility and service. When such desires are denied, life feels stagnant. Shadow work allows these ambitions to surface without shame. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse. It means recognizing their existence and choosing consciously. Dreams, fantasies, and sudden emotional surges often reveal shadow content. Symbols of confrontation, pursuit, or hidden wounds reflect parts of the psyche seeking acknowledgement. Rather than dismissing these images, shadow work invites dialogue with them. What quality does this figure represent? What trait is seeking integration? The process is gradual. The ego resists losing its idealized self-image. Yet every reclaimed fragment increases vitality. Energy once used to suppress now becomes available for creativity and growth. The personality feels less rigid, less defensive. There is greater tolerance for complexity in oneself and in others. Liberation through shadow work is not about becoming morally perfect. It is about becoming psychologically whole. When light and dark aspects are integrated, authenticity replaces performance. Reactions become responses. Compassion expands because self-judgment decreases. The empath who integrates the shadow no longer fears their own intensity. Sensitivity coexists with strength. Kindness coexists with firmness. Vulnerability coexists with power. What was once hidden becomes a source of grounded presence, and the psyche no longer needs to fracture itself to maintain acceptance. Identity is not a fixed structure. It is a psychological construct shaped by experience, memory, and environment, and adaptation. From early childhood, the self begins forming around roles that ensured survival and belonging. A sensitive child may become the peacemaker. A misunderstood adolescent may become the outsider. A responsible sibling may become the strong one. These identities serve a purpose. They provide stability in uncertain environments, but what once protected can later confine. For empaths, identity often crystallizes around emotional responsiveness. Being caring, understanding, and self-sacrificing becomes central to self-definition. The empath may take pride in always being available, always being the listener, always absorbing the emotional weight of others. Over time, this role feels inseparable from who they are. Yet, identity formed through adaptation is rarely complete. It reflects who one had to become, not necessarily who one is capable of becoming. The danger of rigid identity lies in unconscious attachment. When a person clings to a self-image, they resist experiences that threaten it. An empath who identifies as endlessly patient may suppress anger to maintain consistency. One who sees themselves as the healer may avoid acknowledging their own need for help. The psyche prefers familiarity, even when familiarity limits growth. Evolution of identity requires tension. Life introduces challenges that no longer align with the old self-concept. Boundaries must be asserted. Desires must be claimed. Ambitions may conflict with previously embraced humility. This tension signals psychological expansion, yet expansion can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of who one has always believed themselves to be. There is grief in identity evolution. Letting go of an old self-image means acknowledging that it is incomplete. It may also mean accepting that certain relationships were sustained by that identity. When an empath stops overgiving, some connections shift or dissolve. When they stop minimizing their needs, they may be perceived differently. The fear of rejection can tempt them to retreat back into familiar roles. However, stagnation carries its own cost. When identity does not evolve, inner dissonance grows. Desires are suppressed to maintain coherence. Emotional exhaustion increases because the persona no longer fits the inner reality. The gap between authentic impulse and performed identity widens. Over time, this misalignment manifests as anxiety, resentment, or a subtle sense of emptiness. Identity evolution is not about discarding past traits, but integrating them into a broader self-concept. The caring empath can also be decisive. The listener can also speak firmly. The nurturer can also prioritize personal growth. Expansion means allowing complexity rather than reducing oneself to a single narrative. Self-inquiry is central to this process. Questions such as, who am I beyond my roles? Or what would I choose if I were not afraid of disappointing others? Invite deeper awareness. These questions may initially provoke discomfort because they destabilize established patterns. Yet they open the door to authenticity. Growth often requires experimenting with new behaviors, saying no when one would normally say yes, expressing disagreement without apology, pursuing goals that are not centered on service. Each action slightly reshapes identity. Repeated over time, these choices form a more integrated self-image. There is also an internal restructuring that occurs. Beliefs, once accepted as truth, are re-examined. I must always be needed may shift to I am valuable even when I'm not giving. Conflict is dangerous may shift to conflict can clarify truth. These cognitive shifts alter emotional responses and behavioral patterns. Identity must remain dynamic because life itself is dynamic. Stages of development require different strengths. The traits necessary for childhood. Survival may not serve adult autonomy. The qualities that build early relationships may not support long-term fulfillment. Psychological maturity involves recognizing when an old identity has reached its limit. As identity evolves, the individual experiences greater coherence between inner truth and outward expression. There is less effort in maintaining a persona and more energy available for purposeful action. The self becomes less about performance and more about alignment. For empaths, this evolution is particularly transformative. Sensitivity remains, but it is no longer the sole defining feature. Strength, ambition, discernment, and independence find equal space within the psyche. The individual steps beyond inherited narratives and self-imposed limitations, allowing identity to expand in response to conscious choice rather than unconscious habit. Letting go is rarely gentle. It is not a simple decision to move forward or a motivational shift in perspective. Psychologically, it feels closer to a death. Something familiar collapses, a belief, an attachment, an identity, a dream, and the collapse creates a void. The mind resists this void because it prefers continuity. Even painful continuity feels safer than uncertainty. For empaths, letting go can feel especially destabilizing. Attachment is not superficial, it is emotional immersion. When an empath bonds with a person, a memory, or a version of themselves, the connection roots deeply into the psyche. Releasing it can feel like tearing out a part of one's own emotional structure. The grief is not exaggerated, it reflects genuine internal change. Inner death occurs when the self concept built around a past attachment can no longer be sustained. Perhaps it is the identity of being the rescuer in a relationship that has ended. Perhaps it is the belief that enduring suffering proves loyalty. Perhaps it is the hope that someone will eventually validate what was never acknowledged. When reality contradicts these internal narratives, the psyche faces a choice: cling or transform. Clinging preserves familiarity but prolongs stagnation. Transformation requires surrender. Surrender, in this context, does not mean defeat. It means accepting that the old structure cannot continue. The expectations, the fantasies, the justifications, they must dissolve. This dissolution feels like loss because it is loss. The ego loses control over a story it once believed in. The process resembles psychological winter. Energy retracts inward. Motivation may temporarily decrease. There is introspection, sometimes confusion, sometimes emptiness. The outer world continues, but internally there is rearrangement. Old emotional investments withdraw. The psyche reallocates energy that was once tied to maintaining attachment. During this phase, fear often arises. Without the old identity or attachment, who am I? Without this relationship, what defines me? Without this resentment, what fuels me? These questions reflect the instability of transition. The ego seeks immediate replacement to avoid uncertainty. Yet premature replacement interrupts genuine rebirth. The void must be tolerated long enough for something authentic to emerge. Inner death strips away illusion. It exposes where attachment was rooted in unmet needs, fear of abandonment, or avoidance of self-confrontation. The empath may recognize how overgiving masked a desire for validation, how loyalty masked fear of being alone, how nostalgia masked reluctance to face change. Such realizations can feel harsh, but they clarify reality. Grief is a natural companion to this process, not only grief for what was lost externally, but grief for who one was within that attachment. The version of the self that hoped, endured, or sacrificed also fades. Mourning this former self is part of integration. Without acknowledging grief, the psyche risks recreating similar patterns to avoid feeling the loss. Rebirth does not arrive dramatically. It unfolds gradually as new clarity forms. Energy, once bound to the past, becomes available for present creation. Perception sharpens. Boundaries strengthen. Desires, previously muted by attachment, become audible. The self reorganizes around authenticity rather than survival. Rebirth also introduces responsibility. Without the old narrative to blame or cling to, one must choose consciously. Relationships are selected rather than unconsciously repeated. Boundaries are asserted without apology. Goals reflect personal truth rather than inherited expectation. This stage feels lighter, yet more accountable. The cycle of inner death and rebirth is not singular. It repeats across life stages. Each significant transformation requires releasing a previous version of the self. The empath who once defined themselves by endurance may later define themselves by discernment. The one who once equated love with sacrifice may later equate it with reciprocity. Letting go is therefore not erasure of the past, but dissolution of its emotional dominance. Memory remains, but attachment loosens. The self becomes less entangled with what was and more aligned with what is emerging. In the quiet aftermath of surrender, a new configuration of identity begins forming, shaped not by fear or clinging, but by conscious awareness.